waiting room to keep allowing our guests in this evening. So good evening. My name is Rebecca Martin. I'm the advocacy consultant for Riverkeeper in collaboration with Scenic Hudson. Happy to be here this evening with all of you, and welcome to our briefing, What's at Stake, for the Hudson River PCBs Superfund site, a presentation by the Friends of a Clean Hudson, our coalition of partners. And I'm just going to go over a couple of quick housekeeping matters before turning it over to our colleague Pete Lopez. So this evening's presentation is being recorded. We'll stop recording the briefing when we're finished with our panelists, to be able to do a pretty lengthy question and answer period portion during tonight's briefing. So please hold your questions until that time, where you'll be asked to, if you have a question, to use the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen, as well as you can submit comments in the chat function too of your Zoom account. Materials from today's presentation that include fact sheets in English and Spanish, a PDF of slides from tonight's presentation, and a link to the video, as well as our extended analysis will be sent to all participants so that you'll have that for review. We'll also be discussing next steps at the end of the presentation, the end of the briefing, to help to align all of the guests.
There's no sound on this.
Because it's coming into my hearing aids.
Oh, turn it off.
Okay.
Please mute your audio if you're online and turn off your cameras. That would be much appreciated. Thank you so much. And we're going to continue here. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Pete Lopez, who will take it away, who's the Executive Director of Policy Advocacy and Science at Scenic Hudson. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, Rebecca, and to my colleagues. It's a pleasure to be with all of you, and we're very thankful that we have our many guests here in the audience this evening in our Zoom meeting. We're especially thankful for the leadership of Congressman Molinaro and Congressman Ryan, who are helping advocate with others to carry information that affects all of us in regard to rapid remediation of the PCBs. We have, if we can switch to another slide here, I think there's a slide that I think folks would like to see. It shows our two congressmen on the bridge. If we go back 1 second here. So that's an earlier shot, and I'm sure that both congressmen remember that shot fondly. What we have there is two individuals who care very much about the community, who are interested in the impacts of public health and the importance of leading with science, meeting together across the Hudson River. So here they are together, formally as county executives, I should say, respectfully. So for Dutchess and Ulster County, they continue that bipartisan collaboration, and we're very thankful that both of them are here. So with that, I would like to open up the floor. I believe Congressman Ryan had asked to speak, but we'd like to give time to both members. I know their time is the.
Hey everybody, can you hear me? Can somebody give me a thumbs up? Awesome. Hey Mark.
Hey Pat.
Sorry, we're all rushing in, and I'm literally just made it to my desk in time to do this. So it's great to be with you all. And I will note that in that picture, I definitely had much less gray hair than I have now, and maybe none. And that was not that long ago. So we can all make whatever judgments and determinations about the fun we're having in Congress right now by that aging that occurred. But really appreciate the chance to be on with everybody here. This coalition on the line, as you all know, is a powerhouse when you unite these groups and you put at stake our river and the people that love it and live sort of by, with, and through it. And so I'm really, really honored to be on with you all. Proud to have fought on this issue with a lot of you and other ones too, including on the barge issue, which I know is related but separate to the conversation tonight. And I really want to thank Marc. It is really rare. I've been here almost 2 years now. It is incredibly rare to have something like the partnership that we have. And I think it is actually born out of the work we did literally in that photo and work we did at the local level with a lot of you all, just putting the interests of the community ahead of partisanship, which sounds cliche, but is really, really not happening right now in a lot of places. So just want to thank you, Marc. I want to thank all the groups on the line for bringing us together and sometimes pushing us too to make sure we work together. So the main thing I just want to say, you're going to hear from the experts tonight, but the key takeaway from me is we have to push at this moment really, really hard. It's a critical moment where, in my opinion, in addition to the science from a sort of more a broader perspective, we cannot let off the hook the folks that did devastating and still very much in repair damage to our river, to the wildlife, to all that goes around it. And we have to push the EPA specifically to give this not protective determination, which we're worried that they may not. So I know that that's part of our goal here, is to educate and mobilize the community. I'm certainly all in, and we are making that push. Marc and I co-wrote a letter with several other colleagues that to sort of make clear a bit of a shot across the bow that our expectations are high and continue to be high, and that we're all watching. So that's really the high level message that I wanted to deliver is 1, thank you. 2, let's continue the fight. And 3, let's be specific about this not protective determination that will really make the difference for, my 2 and 4-year-old boys, that I hope someday we can get to a place where we can actually say things are fully resolved and fully remediated, but we are far from that point, unfortunately, as all the science leads us to. So really appreciate the opportunity, and I'll either hand it back to Pete or hand it to Marc, whoever wants to jump in.
I am more than happy to
Please.
forego Pete's pleasantries in introducing me. But I do appreciate it. Pete and I served in the state legislature together. It's good to be back with you. And Pat, thank you. I'll share some thoughts about Pat, but first let me also thank the coalition and all of you for coming together today, and truly for coming together for generations. I still may look very youthful, but of course I joined this fight in 1994, having grown up and worked in a little Hudson River community, Tivoli, New York, where in fact our connection to the Hudson was severed, and our desire to return to it was only renewed in the late 90s, when there was some glimmer of hope that either through a heritage river designation and then ultimately EPA's agreement to force GE to clean up, we thought that this was the once in a lifetime moment, and it is. Pat and I have been good friends and colleagues. I think Pat says we've had an interesting history, the two of us, but interesting generally builds camaraderie and appreciation for the skills that we each possess. And Pat, it's been truly a pleasure to be a partner and a friend. We've worked together not only here in Congress, but of course worked together as county executives. But Pat and I both bring our passion to protect and enhance the Hudson River, not only as a waterway, but obviously as an economic engine, and one of this nation's greatest natural resources. We've brought that collective concern and interest to Washington. Pat mentioned, of course, I was happy to co-sponsor his legislation to protect the Hudson from new anchorage points and barges. We together support the New York, New Jersey Watershed Protection Act and Delaware River Basin Act. We have been working together, obviously, on this issue as well. Many times in politics, and I've learned in Washington, folks announce this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. Yet they generally say that knowing full well within the next 5 years, there'll be another once in a lifetime opportunity. That's not the case in this case. You have pushed the EPA to a point where we are on the verge of finally having a total commitment to total cleanup of the Hudson, and the EPA can set us backwards and end that progress, or with a non-protective determination really say not only for those who drink water and drink the water from the Hudson and enjoy it both as a recreation and economic engine, they can say today that we intend to continue to push forward, or we will backslide. And we just can't allow that to happen at all. Too many have invested too much, and this resource is too valuable to allow for the EPA not to take that non-protective action determination. So we remain committed to that push. I will say without question, Pat and I want to continue to work with all of you. And I would really encourage you to not only to advocate, but to irritate and agitate town, village, and county governments to stand with you, to agitate, advocate, and irritate state legislators, Republican and Democrat, to stand with us. And then to say to members of Congress, no matter where you are along the Hudson River, whether it's upper, middle, or lower Hudson River, this is our one and only opportunity to ensure that the EPA does its job and that those who polluted this resource are held accountable, and that future generations have the benefit, the beauty, and the glory of growing up along and with a clean Hudson River. And so I'm just very, very, very thrilled that you're all continuing the fight, and we're going to continue to work with all of you. So I appreciate it. Happy to be with you. And like Pat, I assume I sadly have to jump off, but I'll just close in saying to you, having been that once village mayor, I can along the Hudson, our lives and livelihoods depend on the beauty and the and the environmental sensitivity and the cleanliness of that Hudson River, and we just can't slide backwards.
Congressman, thank you so much.
Thank you both.
Both of you. And we know they have their staff with us for the rest of the program. So we're very thankful for your office's support and engagement. So as we move forward, we have two individuals we'd like to introduce, our colleagues from Friends of Clean Hudson, Drew Gamels and Althea Malarkey. One of our goals tonight through the Friends of Clean Hudson is to make sure that everyone who cares about the future of the Hudson River has both the context and the data, the information surrounding the ongoing efforts to restore the health of the Hudson. And for that, I'd like to introduce Drew, who's a staff attorney at Hudson Riverkeeper, founding member of the Friends of the Clean Hudson, and a member of the Hudson CAG, and Althea Malarkey, a project matter expert on the Hudson Superfund site for Scenic Hudson for many years, originally on staff at Scenic Hudson and now serving as a consultant. So with that, I'll turn it to Drew and Althea. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pete. Really appreciate that, and really appreciate the Congressman's speeches and just being with us this evening. What great remarks. What a way to start us off. For the rest of the presentation, we're going to start off with a history of the Hudson River and the Hudson River PCB Superfund site. We'll talk about the status of the cleanup and the 5-year review. We'll go into a discussion about the PCB concentration in fish and sediment and walk you through the data with our expert, Kevin Farrar. And then we'll have a discussion with Dr. Carpenter about what's at stake, focusing on public health and environmental justice. And we'll end with a discussion about upcoming actions. What can we do to continue to pressure EPA for a not protective determination? And we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Althea, to walk us through that history.
Thank you so much, Drew. And I do wish if the Congressman's staff is still on board, I just want to say thank you very much. You couldn't see me back over here, but I was clapping while they were talking, and their championship certainly has meant a lot to this fight, and it's going to mean a lot going into the future. Next slide. So just to give a little bit of quick context for the site history, a lot of people think this sort of began maybe in the late 90s, or it began maybe in the early 90s when they first talked about getting a rod, or it began in 2009 when they started the cleanup. In fact, this problem, this toxic legacy of PCBs in the Hudson River began in the 1940s. At the time, General Electric had 2 capacitor plants in the upper Hudson in Washington and Warren County, and they were creating a lot of things that, we'll be honest, helped move our society forward at a time when we wanted them to. But it was also true at the same time, they knew that they had waste product that they were dumping into the river that was not safe. As early as the 1930s, the Harvard Medical School had done a study on General Electric workers and knew that there was cancers and other types of diseases that were coming about because of exposure to polychlorinated biphenyls, the toxic waste product of the product that General Electric was dumping into the river whole scale for many years. Move forward, we know that in 1984, EPA finally designated a 200-mile stretch of the Hudson River as a federal Superfund site. In 2002, they adopted a record of decision, and that record of decision is really, really key to what we're talking about tonight. The 5-year review, which is the process that's underway right now, part of what it's supposed to determine is, in fact, the remedy, the remedial action that they implemented. Is it getting us to the goals that the record of decision laid out? The agreement that General Electric made, not just with EPA, but the agreement they made with New York State and the public. So we're going to be talking about that in a little bit. So 2009 to 2015, they dredged only in the Upper Hudson. They're just now starting to pay attention to the other 200 miles stretch of the Superfund site right now. And in 2019, EPA issued General Electric a certificate of completion of the remedial action. Simply put, did they do the work that we asked them to do? It wasn't an acknowledgement they did everything that they needed to do, but in fact, did they do what we asked them to do? And we're not arguing with that. What we're saying is it's not what you pulled out of the river that matters. It's what you left behind that's impacting us today. Next slide. So this just gives you a little snapshot of what the 5-year review actually concentrates on. The Upper Hudson River for 6 years saw a remedial action, digging. They dug out dirty sediment from the bottom of the Hudson River, sucked all the water out, cleaned the water, threw it back in the river, and then they took these little toxic waste cakes of sediment from the Upper Hudson, took them across the country and dumped them in a variety of places and sealed them up until at some point in the future, we can figure out how to get rid of this toxic sediment in a manner that's safe. But we're going to be specifically talking about during the science, just this upper 40 miles of the Upper Hudson River. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that the entire Superfund site from Washington County down to the Battery in New York City is in fact one of the country's largest Superfund sites. Next slide. And for that, I'm actually going to turn the status of the cleanup and the current status of the 5-year review over to Drew.
Awesome. Thank you, Althea. We can move to the next slide. So let's get right into it. As Althea said, in 2002, EPA selected a cleanup remedy for the Upper Hudson River sediments, and that included 3 main elements: the targeted dredging, followed by monitored natural recovery, and then institutional controls in the form of fish consumption advisories. And part of the remedy included these interim targets that we've really been focusing on. And the interim targets were target concentrations of PCBs in fish fillet at a level of 0.4 milligram per kilogram, which they said that would be achieved within 5 years after dredging was completed. So dredging was completed in 2015. That means that 0.4 was meant to be achieved in 2020. The second interim target goal was 0.2 milligrams per kilograms, which was meant to be achieved within 16 years post-dredging. So that's 2031. Now, 2020 has come and gone, and we have not met that 0.4 milligram per kilogram target. And we're not on track to see that 0.2 milligram per kilogram target be met either. The other target that was set forth in the record of decision was an anticipated rate of decline of 8% in PCB sediment concentrations. Now, the surface sediment concentrations are actually much higher than EPA anticipated, and the rate of decline is actually flattening. And we're going to get into that a little more later on in the presentation. But the key for these interim targets is that they mean that we are working towards a goal to make the Hudson River safer and to be able to reduce these fish consumption advisories. So in the Upper Hudson River, we have an eat none advisory. You cannot eat any fish from the Upper Hudson River. And there are also some serious restrictions in the Lower Hudson River as well. Next slide. So we're talking about this in depth right now because we're expecting the third 5-year review this summer. Now, under the Superfund law, 5-year reviews are required when hazardous substances remain at the site. So even though they dredged the upper Hudson River from 2009 to 2015, there are still a ton of PCBs that were left behind and remain in the river at levels that are unsafe for humans and the environment. Now, the purpose of the 5-year review is to ensure that the remedial action is working as intended and is protective of human health and the environment. Now, these 5-year reviews are performed by EPA following the start of the Superfund response action. So in this case, we had our first 5-year review for the Hudson River Superfund site in June of 2012. So in 2012, dredging was still ongoing, and the EPA determined that the remedy will be protective after the completion of dredging. They anticipated that it was going to work as it was intended and protect the human health and the environment. Fast forward to 2019, when EPA issued the second 5-year review report. Now, at that time, dredging was completed. It had been completed for 4 years, but EPA deferred rendering a determination of protectiveness until they could collect more fish and tissue data. Now, when they're doing a 5-year review, they're going to evaluate it using these 3 questions. Question A, is the remedy functioning as it intended by the decision documents? Question B, are the exposure assumptions, toxicity data, cleanup levels, and remedial action objectives used at the time of the remedy selection still valid? And question C, has any other information come to light that could call into question the protectiveness of the remedy? So we have used our technical experts to review publicly available data and evaluate these 3 questions. And our conclusion is that based on the data available, the remedy is not functioning as it's intended and is not protective of human health and the environment. Now, the data speaks for itself, and I'll let Kevin Farrar walk you through our amazing graphs that we have on this. But in addition, I just want to emphasize that we also believe that in this 5-year review, EPA must take into account the most recent environmental justice policies adopted by the agency, and also look at the impacts of the fish consumption advisories. Because PCB concentrations in fish have failed to decline to the levels that were anticipated, EPA has to continue to rely on fish consumption advisories, and such reliance is not an effective nor a just control of the human health risks, particularly for low-income families and disadvantaged communities who subsist on the river's tainted fish. PCBs continue to contaminate the river so that fish caught in the upper Hudson can't be eaten, and fish consumption is heavily restricted in the lower Hudson, as I said before. So it's just such an important point. So we're waiting to hear what EPA is going to say about these 3 questions and what determination they're going to render in this upcoming third 5-year review. But we'll walk you through the data next. So I'll hand it back to Pete to introduce Kevin.
Thank you, my friend. And Althea and Drew, excellent job. Folks, I'd like to introduce you to a dear colleague of ours, Kevin Farrar. Kevin is of the belief, we all are of the belief that the most current science should always lead the way on Superfund cleanups. And Kevin is a retired engineering geologist from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. He managed a unit responsible for remediation of major hazardous waste sites in New York State, including the Hudson River PCB site. Kevin's considered an expert resource as a consultant on technical and project management issues, including PCB remediation, remedy selection, geology, hydrogeology, and geotechnical issues, focusing on data interpretation, analysis, and conceptual site model development. So we're very pleased he could be with us to share findings from him and our colleague Jay Field. Kevin.
Hello, folks. If you could go to the next slide, please. So this first graph, it depicts some fish data. Now it says at the top, weighted total, average total PCB in the upper Hudson's for 2016 to 21, this graph. This weighted average is a metric that EPA developed. It has 3 different species, bass, bullhead, and perch, and it weights it also by the different parts of the upper Hudson. So it's river section length average and species weighted average. So this is not any one particular fish. This is a EPA metric designed to represent the sport fish as a whole in the upper Hudson. Excuse me. And what you can see is that on a wet weight, how much PCB is in the animal basis, that concentrations did go down by this metric after the first year of dredging, rather the first year after dredging, but that the concentration, the rate of decline has slowed quite a bit. And that more importantly, as Drew described earlier, the targeted concentrations for 5 years after dredging of 0.4 was not met in 2020. And it does not appear that we're on a good likely path to reach the 0.2 target. And those are important because those represent concentrations at which EPA and the New York State might work on talking to the health department about reducing the fish consumption advisories. So meeting those targets, getting that rapid risk reduction so people could start to fish again was a very important target set by EPA in their remedy selection. So that's one view of the fish data, looking at this overall average metric that EPA has. Can you go to the next slide, please? Another way to look at the data that's available, there was data that was collected in the surface sediment. This is the top 2 inches is what was chosen for this monitoring effort. In other words, samples collected a little bit in 2016 and then a lot in 2017 and again in 2021. So if you look at the concentrations that we would have expected to see in 2021, that's the yellow bars, and the red bar is what was actually measured. So if you start with the concentration in River Section 1, for example, you would have expected the concentrations with this anticipated decline of 8% per year. Monitored natural recovery was supposed to take us the rest of the way to the targets. So if monitored natural recovery occurred at 8% per year, we should have been about 1.5 part per million in surface sediments in River Section 1, but we're actually almost at 4. In River Section 2, we would have anticipated at that natural recovery rate that EPA thought was going to happen, should have been about 3.7, but instead we're almost at 4.5. And River Section 3, again, it was anticipated to be about 1.18, and it's a little over 1.5. So the rate of decline in surface sediment concentrations is really not what we were looking for. It's not what EPA had anticipated would happen during this period of natural recovery after dredging. Go to the next slide, please. So here's some different fish data. The first fish graph talked about sport fish, which is the bass and the bullhead and the perch. This talks about pumpkin seed. The pumpkin seeds have been collected every year for a number of years, and they're rapid integrators. They're intended to be the smallest ones. Typically, they're a year, maybe a little bit older than a year old. So it would show rapid, if there were rapid changes or any changes at all from year to year, pumpkin seed should show it. They also represent what the bigger fish are eating, and also what the other piscivorous wildlife, fish eating birds and mammals, for example, would be eating pumpkin seed and similar fish. So what we see here is that, again, the yellow bar is where we would have thought we would have been had that 8% decline occurred. And the kind of brick red bar is where we actually were in these 3 river sections in 2021. So you can see is that in River Section 1, we would have thought that we would have been around 3/4 of a part per million, but we're at about 4.5. And River Section 2, if natural recovery had been happening at the rate we would have anticipated, and more importantly, what EPA anticipated at the time of remedy selection, would have been around 2 part per million, but instead we're over 7. And in River Section 3, again, that anticipated concentration would be about 3/4 of a part per million, but we're at about 1.6. So altogether, we look at the surface sediment, and the rate of decline during natural recovery is simply not what was anticipated. We look at the small fish, and we're not getting the recovery that we anticipated. So if the sediment's not going down at the rate we thought, and the little fish aren't going down at the way we thought, that's why almost certainly the sport fish in that first metric, that weighted average sport fish metric, that's probably why they're not reaching their targets as well. So we look at all the important media here, and they're all telling about the same story. And I think that's it.
Kevin, thank you so much. We're glad you could join us. Thanks for sharing that important data. As we move forward, I'd like to introduce Dr. David Carpenter. And just in prefacing, one of the worst and most enduring tragedies of PCB pollution is the impact it has on the human condition, what the toxins do to our people. So we'll have Dr. Carpenter, a Harvard-trained physician, speak to us about the impacts. Dr. Carpenter is a professor and director at SUNY Albany's Public School of Health. He's devoted his life understanding to environmental causes of human disease, especially chronic diseases of older age, such as cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, and more. He studied rates of hospitalization for these and other diseases in relation to living near hazardous waste sites, fossil fuel power plants, and other areas of contamination in New York, and is world-renowned expert on the toxicity of PCBs. So with that said, I'd like to turn it over to our dear friend and colleague, Dr. Carpenter.
Thank you very much, Pete. Could we have the next slide? So my colleagues and I, for a long time, have looked at what diseases people get more frequently if they live near to a hazardous waste site. And the upper left here shows the map of New York State, where the red is zip codes that contain PCBs. And you see that long line on the right side, which is the Hudson River, all 200 miles, that's a hazardous waste site. And there are other waste sites throughout the state. Now, the blue marked zip codes that have a hazardous waste site, but they don't contain PCBs. And all of the other areas don't have any identified hazardous waste site, either by DEC or the federal government. So our question was, does simply living by a hazardous waste site increase your risk of disease? Now, the results of some of the things are shown in the bottom there. We called the zip codes that didn't have a hazardous waste site clean. Doesn't mean that they are clean. It just means they don't have an identified hazardous waste site. And then we compare the waste sites that have PCBs, the waste sites that have other chemicals, and then we looked specifically along the Hudson River. Now, one of the problems is that poor people tend to live near contaminated sites. And therefore, when you try to look at rates of disease, now I should have said that we are using the health department's Sparks data, which means if you were admitted to a hospital anywhere in New York State, except for federal hospitals like VA and Indian Health Service, when you're discharged, the hospital must report to the Department of Health every disease you have, up to 15 different diseases. Now, we got our hazardous waste information from DEC and from the federal government. So we started looking then at the diseases people have if they live in a zip code that has PCB contamination. And what you see, if you look in the lower left under PCBs, there was a 19% increase in the frequency of cardiovascular disease, a 15% increase in high blood pressure, and a 23% increase in diabetes if you lived by a PCB hazardous waste site. Now, if you lived by a hazardous waste site that didn't have PCBs but had other things, it was much less for cardiovascular disease and for high blood pressure, but it was about the same for diabetes. But then we looked at the Hudson River, and the reason we looked at the Hudson River is that people living in zip codes on both sides of the Hudson River have a higher average income than people in the rest of the state. It's a beautiful hazardous waste site, and it's an attractive place to live. They also have a higher consumption of fruits and vegetables, a better diet. They exercise more, and they smoke less than other people in the state, reflecting basically higher income and higher education. Yet, if you look along the Hudson, there was even a greater increase in the rates of heart disease, and especially diabetes, less so for hypertension, than in the rest of the state. Well, we were surprised by these results. These are what we call ecologic studies. We didn't have measurements of individuals. We were only looking at the whole populations living near to these waste sites. Now, the first question was, why would we find these patterns? It's unlikely that people living by a hazardous waste site would just eat the fish. So we started looking at the air levels. And what we found is that the air levels of PCBs, now PCBs are not very volatile, but they're called semi-volatile chemicals. And the PCBs that go into the air are those that have fewer chlorines than those that are commonly found in fish and food. We found that there were elevations in the air quality in the upper Hudson, but it was almost as great in the mid-Hudson. And in fact, not very much lower in the lower Hudson. And that's compared to the background air concentrations, which are very much smaller than those that you get around the Hudson River. So our hypothesis was this must be you're breathing in PCBs from the river. Now, again, PCBs dissolve in water, and then they evaporate with water from the river. And so it's going to be more in the summertime when the weather's warm than when it's not. And so these are not huge concentrations. But now, again, I said these are ecologic studies, so we needed to document in real studies where we had measurements of PCBs in people. We worked with two populations, residents of Anniston, Alabama, that live around the Monsanto plant that made PCBs. We showed clearly by taking measurements of their body burden of PCBs, by taking 3 different measurements of their blood pressure, that the PCB concentration was a greater risk factor for high blood pressure than their race, than their BMI, their level of obesity, than their serum lipids, than anything else that we could find. PCBs cause high blood pressure. The other population we've worked with primarily has been with the Mohawks at Akwesasne in northern New York and southern Canada. We studied diabetes there. We got measurements of their medical records. We took their fasting blood glucose levels. We took their measurements of PCBs. We found that their PCB levels were a strong predictor of whether or not they developed type 2 diabetes. And furthermore, we could demonstrate that the biggest risk factor from those was from those PCBs that have few chlorines that are more volatile, consistent with our conclusion from these ecologic studies that inhaling PCBs increases your risk of these chronic diseases. Now, in the ecologic studies, we didn't find very much difference between the Hudson, the upper Hudson, the mid Hudson, and the lower Hudson. Think about it. The water is flowing from Hudson Falls all the way down to Manhattan. The water contains these PCBs that have been dissolved. They're evaporating. So this issue is not just one of fish consumption. Now, the next slide. There still is a very major problem with environmental justice. It's true that a lot of the people living along the Hudson River have higher incomes, but there are a lot of poor people, not necessarily living by the river, but they derive a lot of their food supply and their protein by fishing and eating the fish that are in the river. As you've just heard, those fish are still highly contaminated. And we have got to not only get the fish down to levels where it's safe to eat the fish just for the help of all of these poor people that depend on it for just food intake, but we also have to get the level of PCBs in the water that then go into the air that affect the health of everybody that lives by the river. It's not just the poor people. They're more impacted, but anybody living by the river that's breathing the air 24/7 is inhaling PCBs that are having adverse health effects. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, David. As always, it's go back to the previous slide. I'd like just to emphasize this just a little bit. No, yeah, thank you. Just to wrap this up a little bit and to reiterate sort of what we're talking about is the concerns that EPA must and should address in the third 5-year review really are focused around a lot of environmental justice and public health concerns, as you just heard David talk about. Right now, the human health and ecological risks are well above EPA's acceptable risk range. It's simply just a fact. And fish consumption advisories, if that is the only measure of control that the EPA has for protecting human health and the environment, it's not effective. And we believe it's not just, particularly for low-income families and disadvantaged communities who want to subsist on the river's fish. And they should be able to. And that's not actually the job of EPA, is not to put the burden of protection on the people themselves. It's to make the polluter do enough that the river can start to heal and be on the path to rural recovery. Right now, the burden with EPA's going to be protective or anything other than not protective, the burden is going to remain on the public to regulate their own behavior to avoid the risk caused by PCBs. And we believe that's truly not fair or just. Next slide. So the actions. So right now, we're waiting on EPA to do its third 5-year review. You've heard what from the congressman, you've heard from the scientists, you've heard from the health experts, you've heard from the scientists. Now you're hearing from the advocates. What can be done? And nothing ever gets done on the Hudson River unless everyone sort of gets together and speaks with one voice. And there is no more powerful community than the Hudson River. Right now, we have to pressure EPA and General Electric to put the Hudson River on a path to rural recovery. We're going to be preparing comments on the draft third 5-year review, but every single person that lives along the Hudson River has a right to comment on that 5-year review. We're encouraging you to stay engaged, just what you're doing tonight, paying attention to webinars like this, and we are committed to, once that 5-year review is published, we'll do our best to look at it, analyze it, break it down into some parts, and go out in the communities like we did the last 2 times and sort of explain to you what it means and what it says. We're asking you to sign up for our Friends of the Clean Hudson mailing list. When the Hudson River has their community advisory group meetings, and we're just going to get started on doing Lower Hudson community advisory group meetings, that is open to the public. And that's the one place where EPA comes and talks to river stakeholders. This is what we're planning to do. This is what we think it's going to do. And it's an opportunity for every single one of us to speak up and say, are you doing enough? Why aren't you doing this? Could you do this? And as you heard from Congressman Molinaro and from Congressman Pat Ryan, contact your elected leaders, your mayors, your county executives, your assemblymen, your senators, and yes, your congressmen and congresswomen, congresspeople, and ask them to speak up as well. When someone from a legislative office contacts the EPA, they talk to them, they find out what's going on. Have them express their concerns. So stay tuned. As soon as the 5-year review is dropped, we're going to have probably another engaged meeting like this where we're going to share with you what we think it's saying. And of course, anytime EPA has a meeting and every time they have a meeting that talks about the 5-year review, we encourage you to participate there as well. Next slide. So this is what we want. We want a non-protective determination, the third 5-year review. And after today's presentation, we're going to be sending you all of the materials that we used to inform and create the graphs. And this also includes an addendum. If anyone that was on our webinar in early November of 2023, you saw that we sort of published we call it sort of like a shadow 5-year review. What we thought the 5-year review should say if EPA was going to publish it at that time. A few months have passed. We've done more analysis. You saw some of the new analysis that Kevin shared with you. So we've published an addendum to that report that we published in November, and we'll share that with you guys as well. And please sign up for Friends of the Clean Hudson updates. You won't be bombarded by a lot of emails. We're simply going to keep you informed and give you opportunities to engage when it makes the most sense. And you can see that that form is right there. And we are now going to open it up for Q&A. And we have Kevin, we have Jay Fields, we have myself, we have Drew Gammels. We have a lot of people that can answer a lot of your questions. So I'm going to open it up for any questions that we have.
Right, and I'm just going to jump in and ask you to stop recording the presentation, Althea. And for the public, again, thank you